but here we go. Let's hope that it works. Dr. Bankston, all yours.
Hello, thanks for having me here. So actually I didn't expect this question about my background, but I'll give you a little bit. So I have transitioned from the bench in the last 4 years now, I guess, through all these different nonprofits that were really helpful for gaining policy skills, either kind of at the side of my job or actually working for one of them at some point. And then my SFN fellowship was really helpful for transitioning into actually working in an environment like this, where you actually do policy and advocacy day to day. And currently in my job, I'm working for University of California. And so it's really an interesting medium now, I guess, because so my main job is to connect researchers to policymakers and kind of vice versa from the system to DC. And but now with COVID, there's a lot more, there's another layer of research policy that we're following, and that sort of made our life more complicated. But at the same time, I'm enjoying it because it's helped kind of think about the research system and the workforce of the next generation and how we're training people to be scientists and whether they will stay in science. And COVID obviously has made things harder. So these are the kinds of things I'm interested in, sort of long-term training and workforce development. And so for me, it's actually been really interesting to be in this position right now because I get to do a lot of things that I enjoy in addition to learning from really smart people in the office. So that's pretty much it. So I'm happy to chat with you later if you want to hear more about my career and all that after the class. But we can, let's see, I can share this now. Okay. Here we go. Let me make this smaller. Great. Okay. So today we're here to talk about this policy analysis paper that was published in the journal Science Policy and Governance. And so I'm coming to you from my position as Chief Outreach Officer at JSPG. I wanted to just tell you a little bit about the journal before we start and hopefully help kind of facilitate some submissions to the journal later on. So JSPG is an internationally recognized publication, which is open access and peer-reviewed. We're also a nonprofit, and beyond the publications, we actually do try to think about JSPG as kind of a professional development tool for early career researchers in science policy. For a lot of them, this is the first piece they've ever written, so they go through the process of editing. Our editorial board is also early career scientists, and so we really try to foster this kind of development in their policy writing and research through the journal, and more sort of outreach, which is what my job is here. So the interesting thing about JSPG is that it's also, as I said, managed by students, policy fellows, and early career scholars. And we really want to serve as an independent platform for them to discuss science policy, to engage in the debates that are going on at the national level, as well as locally. And it's been successful since 2011, I believe. And we've just grown a lot internationally in the last few years as well. So it's been really exciting to be involved with them. And I'm also learning more about policy writing through this. So our main mission is to really help students and early career scholars to bolster their research and writing credentials in science and technology policy, and as well as encourage them to engage in policy making at all levels of government, as I said, locally, as well as nationally and internationally. We, besides the publications that go through the peer review process, we also promote the published work via social media, as well as our mailing list, which is also global and pretty large. We do outreach to partners that we have, as well as different organizations and other channels. So we're quite active on social media. You can follow us on Twitter, Cycle Journal, and the website is there. We have a newsletter that you can subscribe to. And we also we're starting a podcast as well now to interview the authors, which I think will be really fun to really get their work out there. And that's actually an incentive for them to publish also, because not only do they get publishing here is a big deal for them, but also they get to be sort of spotlighted through this outreach and the podcast as well. So more on that later. So in terms of what we actually publish, it's quite a broad range. And I know we're here to talk about policy analysis, but you can see all the different things we publish. OPEDs, technology assessments, policy memos and analysis, which we'll talk about in this classes, as well as white papers, book reviews, workshop proceeding, etc. So there's a lot of different formats and different purposes for these write-ups. As I said, I'm still learning as well, but there's some important differences between these types of writing. And then you can see here a list of all the different topics that we publish on, which is actually very broad. Just to highlight a few here, artificial intelligence, STEM education and workforce, science communication, the government, university, industry interface, etc. So it's really broad, and we're happy to get submissions from early career scientists. So I know that Cindy mentioned to try and make this a little interactive. So I'm actually gonna stop you here and for 1 minute to think about what you would write your analysis on if you had to start now, given that I just showed you all these topics. Maybe just take 30 seconds. And then if we can write in the chat. Yeah, there's the chat. Okay. Environment or nutrition. Anything else? Opioids, yeah.
So I know that everyone here has a science policy passion. They have actually been thoroughly reviewing the science policy journal and governance.
Okay.
And they've actually selected a wide variety of papers to present in the upcoming weeks. And so the topics vary from artificial intelligence to electric vehicles to policies on opioid addiction treatment, using medicine, using data in developing healthcare policies. And I can share that with the class in case you guys forgot, but I actually did post it last night. So they'll be following your lead after today.
Yeah, sounds great. Okay, so just wanted to kind of get you warmed up a little bit to think about this as we move forward. And one thing to mention here is sort of the difference between policy analysis and research. And because this is something that, so research, I suppose, is sort of part of this, but people kind of confuse the term sometimes. So when you think about policy research, it's really sort of broader. It's not really constrained by time. It may be actually less relevant as opposed to policy analysis, which is supposed to be more timely. You need to inform your supervisor or somebody on that policy in a short time, which is usually how policy works. It's more looking at the options that you're interested in, as well as the impact that it will have on the policymakers' decisions that they're making, as opposed to research is sort of, again, you're just analyzing the policy, but it's not really moving it forward into policy problems, as opposed to analysis, which is a more systematic way of looking at what policies exist, what alternatives you might have, what the cost-benefit analysis is, as well as making it really geared towards the federal government. And so just to keep that in mind when you see these terms about research and analysis, research is sort of part of the analysis, but that's really kind of what you want to get at. And then you would use that to inform somebody about a specific policy or sort of your recommendations for that. So before moving on to specifics, I just wanted to give a little bit of information about what we publish in JSPG and also what the differences are between these. And you can read this in the editorial guidelines. But to give you sort of a large, broad view of the different things you can write, you can see that these things are all different lengths. Some of them have recommendations. Oh, sorry. Okay. And some of them have executive summaries, some of them have policy recommendations, not all of them do. Some of them are more balanced, the policy analysis and memo, sort of you're kind of looking at both sides of the policy versus an OPED, which is one-sided and you're sort of giving your opinion, but you wouldn't necessarily target that to a specific person. So just to give kind of a flavor of what the different things are, and again, the length differ and the purpose differs, and then that's useful to look at. And the guidelines actually contain an example of each of these write-ups as well, so you can see another analysis there in addition to what I share. We're gonna go through today. So just to start with the basics, policy analysis is used typically by political analysts or other analysts that are using this to identify and evaluate advantages and disadvantages of specific policies in government and suggest or analyze alternative options. And if you study either government or politics, you'll probably have to write a paper at some point. And this is specifically geared towards government offices such as, and you would sort of analyze it looking at cost-benefit analysis conducted by agency analysts at the federal level. So if you're NIH or something like that. But it's really a useful skill, I think, to learn how to write this sort of paper. So there are two options when you think about analysis. You can either analyze existing policy, which would be more analytical and descriptive, explaining the policy and the development of the policy, or you could analyze a new policy or come up with a new policy, which is sort of prescriptive. What do you see coming up? What policies and proposals would be incorporated in that, and not necessarily what already exists. And so you may even be doing both of these. But just to keep in mind what your purpose would be and kind of lay that out when you're starting to write. The format, at least for JSPG, should be 30 pages or less. Obviously, the one that we're going to read is shorter, but it's just meant to kind of make the distinction between a one-pager and something longer. It will have an executive summary, as well as policy recommendations. And one thing to keep in mind is that when you write this for a policymaker, they're busy people. They won't have time to really read a whole lot. So it has to be really concise as well as accurate, obviously evidence-based and readable, which is something that takes some time to make it in a format that is easy to skim by somebody who has little time, but can still get the gist of what it is quickly. So this is sort of the structure of the paper. So you would introduce the topic, what the problem is, what the key terms are, establish the criteria by which you evaluate the policy and alternatives. You would need to then do some research on the existing literature, both online and print, on your issue. And then figure out what policies exist based on the criteria that you established prior. And here it's important to consider to include the effects of the policy on different groups, any conflicts that it might create, what stakeholders might be involved and how it affects them, and what sort of consensus they might come to or issues that might come up. And identifying policy alternatives, so this is where sort of the analysis comes in. You would evaluate each one individually according to the criteria that you established, as well as discuss the advantages and disadvantages of each option. And you would then make recommendations in the conclusions for changes or alternatives to the existing policy and reiterating your rationale. And then also outline a plan for adopting this alternative policy. And so this is something that, you know, would happen really in the real world of when your boss says, okay, so what did you come up with and how are you actually going to enact that and implement it? So you need to take that sort of one step further and have a plan for adopting and implementing that. So just now, since Cynthia mentioned that you already had sort of a topic in mind, I want to just challenge you for a couple of minutes to think about these different areas of your paper. Obviously, we're not going to go through the literature right now, but just want to hear maybe a couple of people talk about what they want to write on and how they might go about doing that. Think about sort of the criteria and then what kind of policies you might think of in that area.
So just to give some additional guidance here, at the end of the semester, one of the goals is to write a policy memo. By no means as lengthy or exhaustive as an analysis paper, but the memo would be much shorter, 1 page to 2 pages max. And so the question is, based on the House bills that you researched last month, the science editorial, the op-eds that you've been looking at, and now the papers that you've selected to research, study, and present to the class, thinking about all of those different science policies that you've thought about in the past couple months, moving forward, what would the policy memo that you need to write be on? What kind of area are you interested in? And I had advised that since you were doing this in-depth presentation and journal club, that it made sense to stick with the same area, but that's just some advice. So some of you may have gone along with a partner and said, okay, you wanna study opiates, I'll do that, fine. But maybe you have another topic that you're really passionate about. And remember, we talked about passion. Was it this week or last week? Yeah, we talked about passion last week. So remember that when you're thinking about your topic. Hopefully, I know some of you are very passionate about specific ideas, so please share.
So does anybody have kind of a topic and a thought process they want to share, just to kind of go through an example?
So, hello, good morning.
No.
This is Masfin Ashaber. So, me and my partner, we have one paper about the current state of US robotics and artificial intelligence. So, because we are interested in that, is everywhere, wherever we go, there is something that has artificial intelligence. And then even, for example, I work in a pharmacy, so we have a machine that counts the pill. So some store that doesn't have, and then in fact that they prescribe more prescription a day. So I mean, we can. I personally believe that the artificial intelligence and robotics is coming more. So and then also is expected to be is going to cover most of the job for the. It's going to cover more jobs. So we are interested. We don't have any platform or any outline how we can present, but I just want to introduce the topic that we are doing.
Great, that sounds great. Yeah, so JSPG actually published a paper recently on AI and sort of related to inequality and technology in our latest issue. So I can send that to you if that would be helpful. I think it might have some good background.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
I'll do
please.
that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I'll send it to Cindy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So great. So just wanted to kind of get you thinking about this a little bit, how you would formulate your paper and think about these different areas. So happy to review or think about this more if you want to reach out later as you're writing.
All right. Thank you.
So moving on to the paper. So obviously we won't have time to go through sort of the entire paper today. I think, so I heard that you all did a good job with questions, and so you all know what this is about. So I will just go through a little bit of kind of the structure here and what their thought process was by explaining some of the concepts that I brought up before. So this is sort of, again, the structure, topic, criteria, and evidence. So they're specifically looking at the policies in the federal government that are relying on scientific evidence. However, this has been compromised. The sort of criteria or evidence to back up this claim is that there have been a lot of ways that protections for public health and environment have been undermined. Scientists have adapted the term of scientific integrity, and as well as the violation. And as you saw, they asked the question of what does violation of scientific integrity mean, and the background of that in different administrations. The sort of existing policy or the equivalent of this would be that there has been an establishment of this but in the Obama administration, as well as actually coming up with policies related to scientific integrity. And this has been, again, compromised in the Trump administration. They also mentioned that basically this violation, basically after this violation, there has been no analysis conducted examining how the actions of from this administration have resulted in policy change. And then what they're doing here is documenting these records on scientific integrity on different administrations dating back to the 1950s, and stating that this is going to be providing sort of a larger context on the evolution of scientific integrity overall. So I think this is a good example of how you would frame your policy piece around the topic of interest by following this kind of outline and thinking about how they've done it here, but you can apply these principles to kind of your writing too. So I guess, again, to pose a question, just to think about how you would structure your policy on the topic of interest. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to go again. Sorry, I forget your name, whoever spoke before, so maybe we can just keep this kind of going and give us some thoughts on how you would structure your writing.
Well, yeah, I mean, we just chose the topic, and I just wrote a little bit. Not we don't have any exactly like the exact structure or outlook. I mean, outline how we can present or analysis, but yeah. But I'll think about it anyways. Yeah, I have some notes with following up with your PowerPoint. So yeah.
Yeah, I think this would be helpful to go through the exercise as you're writing and think about, okay, what would the evidence look like? What would the recommendations look like? What are the alternatives? Are there limitations to the alternatives? What the conclusion would be? And so again, just to get you thinking about this, and you can follow along and maybe work on your writing as we move forward here.
Okay.
So to go through the paper itself then, again, just to use this as an example for this kind of structure in the introduction, they define scientific integrity and how it becomes government policy. They look at the views of different administrations on the topic and consequences of this. So for example, by the end of the Obama administration, 28 agencies have adopted scientific integrity policies. So this is really impactful in that it's showing you the outcome of the policy change. Whereas in the Trump administration, there have been violations of the scientific integrity. Some of them were unprecedented, and how those were addressed, which I think is fascinating to read the whole paper and go through that. So that's a good framing to looking at how this is then sort of backed up by evidence and what kinds of things they're looking at. So one thing is the existence of data. So data on this topic has been not very available. So obviously whoever wrote the paper had to go through a lot of literature search to write it and figure out how this issue was addressed in different administrations. And so while the data that is required here is comparative, there have been few institutions that actually collected this data. And however, this is necessary, and so this was, you know, taken quite a lot of work here to examine the instances that this term has come up in since 1950, and how that was used in order to examine the Trump administration's relationship to scientific integrity. So just to make the point here that basically this is saying that it's showing you what was existing or not existing before and why this work was done and where that fits into sort of the larger context of why they're doing the work and what they actually did. And then as the results, as you saw, are that, again, so this is a good sort of nice, clear framing of what the results need to look like. That the Trump administration's violations of scientific integrity are continuing from patterns that were built up over the past 7 decades. And again, putting this into larger context to what exists before and how this paper fits in. And the conclusion being that we need to restore science in the proper place in government, which is what Obama has said, as well as strengthening the existing integrity policies. So I think, again, this is a good example of taking sort of one concept and seeing how do you take it from the introduction all the way to the conclusion and what the recommendations might be. So some questions that arise here are actually, which obviously they pose in the discussion, what is actually scientific integrity and how do you know when it has been violated from an ethical and legal standpoint? Again, this is, I think it's a complicated topic, but really fascinating to think about, especially for those of us who are in science or were in science and want to ensure that this is going on moving forward. So some of the things that were mentioned were insufficient positions of people who are actually working on these issues, regulations that are undermined by different stakeholders or different situations, data that has been misrepresented, and this is something that unfortunately exists a lot in scientific literature, as well as the hostile environment, which really a lot of this refers to the way that researchers are being treated in academia, so I can talk to you more about that. But that's part of this, you know, sort of keeping the research system integrity and not just the science itself, but also what's happening around that. And again, what that looks like in different administrations since the 1950s, as well as a timeline of these different issues. So just to sort of summarize this, I think if you were writing on your specific topic, this is a good framework of saying, what is the term that I'm writing on? How do you define that? How do you know that has existed? What is sort of the background on that? And then, you know, backing up by sort of 4 different points here, and what that looks like long-term in terms of a timeline kind of thing. So this is what you would do then. Think about what kind of background do you need to write on the recommendations that you have, what terms do you use, how do you define those terms, where do you find that resource, and what kind of story are you trying to tell? So this is going to depend on obviously the evidence that exists in the background, but you can really frame it based on what you're trying to argue, and that's what the paper will be. So just to keep this in mind as you're writing, the background that you need will be probably pretty extensive, although you don't want to show everything that exists on that topic. So there's a balance of what is sufficient, but necessary to sort of back up what you're saying. And then make sure that you define the terms that you're working on, and figure out sort of how you want to frame this in terms of the story. And then I wanted to show this table as well in terms of how you would go about the thought process related to a specific issue. So just to go through one here, the violation of selectively editing data on websites, what the description is, that the evidence has been deleted, the historical example of the violation in the Bush administration, and the tactic that was used in the Trump administration. So the language was edited. So again, it gets more specific into how this violation actually happened and what terms were used and where it happened sort of over time, and then what we might be able to do to prevent it in the future. So this is also a good kind of framework of thinking about a specific issue that you want to write on, going through this thought process of, okay, what is the issue? What is the evidence? How much detail do I need about that? And then are there things that I could recommend or ways to prevent it, obviously in this case, because it's something that we don't want to see happening. So you're thinking about all the different stakeholders again, or groups that might be able to help. So this brings up, Congress, FOIA, which a lot of times is directed at institutions. Media is also involved. So there may be also different stakeholders that can help with kind of your recommendation or from their perspective. So this is what I would suggest, creating a similar table for your policy issue with data that backs it up, and kind of going through this thought process, because I think that's very helpful in this format. So now in terms of the analysis specifically, these are just some of the elements that I thought were helpful in thinking about this. So barriers that you might see to implementing the policy that you suggest. In this case, specifically, there have been violations of scientific integrity for a long time in this country. They have also increased over time dramatically. And in addition, there are split views of different parties on this issue, as well as factors that are linked to the political environment from each era, as well as increasing polarization on scientific issues. And so this makes it complicated because it's not something that there's an easy consensus on, and this is something that shows up a lot in policy. How do we create policies where different stakeholders are involved and they might be able to agree and come to a consensus, but that doesn't always happen, especially in this case. It's harder because it's something that's been going on for a long time in the United States. So this is helpful, I think, to think about the context again of the issue that's brought up here, and what barriers you might see to implementing your recommendations. That's definitely something to think about. And so shifting now the paper to the current environment. So this has been improved as federal employees now operate with scientific integrity policies. These now exist. There have been actions of the current administration, though, that make it clear that more reforms and oversight is needed. So it's, again, helpful to think about kind of the historical perspective here, as well as the current environment and kind of where your recommendations fit in here. So what they recommend, again, you can see different stakeholders involved here. So there should be reporting of abuse from the executive branch. Congress should also help in protecting the use of science in decision-making. There should be a report on government accountability in terms of the effectiveness of these policies. There should be hearings from science advisory committees. in terms of looking at whether this helps public interest, as well as the media being involved in this and making sure that they report the objective truth on this issue. So I think this is interesting. Again, the concepts here would be sort of the historical perspective, the current political environment, as well as recommendations that would be not just the government agency, even though that's kind of what it's for, because that is an ecosystem where other groups are also involved and feed into that as well. So keep that in mind. So again, this is what I would do then as a roadmap for you, thinking about the barriers and the current environment and the policy, what you might recommend, as well as who the stakeholders are who might benefit from this or might oppose it. Always advise to think about what the opposition might think about to your recommendation. So this is hopefully useful. So that's most of what I had to say. These are just a few writing resources here. You can check out the JSPG Editorial Guidelines, as well as a few other writing guidelines for papers and more broadly. This document from John Holdren is really helpful. So he actually has a lot of different mistakes in professional writing that you don't want to do, as well as JSPG can be a resource for you, as well as other write-ups. So I'm happy to send you also other papers if that would be helpful. You can peruse the volumes. And then finally, just this is my contact and my website. I'm also on LinkedIn and Twitter, so I'm happy to connect with you further to discuss policy writing or careers, anything that might be helpful. And I will share these slides with Cindy as well after.